Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. I'm Mark Magnacca. My co-host Rob Brant and I are joined today by Dale Swampy, President of the National Coalition of Chiefs, the principal pro-development voice in Canadian Indigenous policy, representing 81 First Nation chiefs working to advance Indigenous ownership and equity participation in Canadian major resource projects. Dale brings 2 decades on the front line of Canadian pipeline consultation, including his role leading the Aboriginal Equity Partners process for the Northern Gateway pipeline, where 31 of 40 directly affected First Nations communities signed on as project supporters. In our conversation, you'll hear why Northern Gateway 2.0 only proceeds with First Nations at the helm. Learn how the coalition model has produced multi-billion-dollar Indigenous asset acquisitions across Canada. And understand how the positive shift in Canadian sentiment around energy security is reshaping the political economics of major project approval. So let's get into this fascinating conversation. Welcome, Dale Swampy, President of the National Coalition of Chiefs. Great to have you on Drumbeats. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Dale, really nice for you to take the time to join us on Drumbeats. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, and what you're doing today?
Well, I'm from the Samson Cree Nation. It's part of the 4 Musqueam Cree tribal communities in Alberta, South Edmonton, about 100 kilometers south of Edmonton. We have a population of about 10,000 people. We're one of the richest bands in Canada, over $1 billion in assets, one of the largest private landowners in Alberta, some 48,000 acres of farming and ranching land, and 28 corporations, including a bank and insurance company. But at the same time, we suffer under the same conditions that most other First Nations across this country have, and that is about 60% of our community is unemployed and on social welfare. So I worked with my band for 22 years after college and left there as a CEO and started with another chief as a consultant in the oil and gas industry, and worked in that industry for the past 19 years, and then basically started on pipeline consultation, worked on Fort Hills, then got into Alberta Clipper and Southern Lights, and then moved on to Northern Gateway. It was in Northern Gateway where we got the impetus to form the National Coalition of Chiefs. It was Northern Gateway that formed a coalition, one of the biggest coalitions around. Some 31 communities got together to negotiate as a group with the Northern Gateway owners, which included 9 oil sands and conventional oil producers, and Enbridge, the pipeliner.
Dale, can you just explain to some of our users Northern Gateway, just so they have that background?
Yeah, so Northern Gateway was a proposed bitumen pipeline delivering oil from the oil sands from Bruderheim, Alberta, to the coast, Kitimat, BC. And it was that project that I worked on for 8 years that we were able to get 31 out of the 40 communities signed on as supporters. And it was the late Chief Elmer Derrick from the Gitxsan Nation who got the chiefs together and formed this coalition. And I was appointed the mediator of that group. And we continued on for 6 years, negotiating with the owners group until 2006, November 26, 2006, when Trudeau just summarily canceled the project, and we formed the National Coalition of Chiefs immediately after that, and we've been working ever since to revitalize the Northern Gateway 2.0 and to promote the coalition model across the country for First Nations to utilize as a method of not just negotiating with major projects, but in getting infrastructure built and cleaning up our water and so forth. And we've been very busy connecting industry with First Nation communities as well. We have 2 conferences, the NCC Clean Energy Summit, which we had in April, and the NCC Energy and Natural Resource Summit, which we're hosting in October.
Thank you for that background. Can you explain why to our viewers, why did that Northern Gateway stop?
Well, it was obviously a decision by the federal government. Trudeau didn't want a bitumen pipeline going to the northern west coast of Vancouver. His father was given an honorary chieftainship from the Haida Nation on Haida Gwaii, which was originally called the Queen Charlotte Islands. So I think it was a personal thing. We had our 31 communities together, and we tried on 8 different occasions to meet with the Prime Minister. He wouldn't meet with us. He wouldn't even respond, actually. And we knew exactly why, because when he announced the cancellation, he basically said to the Canadian public he hadn't heard of any one First Nation community member that supported the project. Well, of course, because he never met with us, right? So we felt, we were singled out, and that it was something that was, pretty upsetting for the 31 communities, because they were going to get $2 billion in benefits over 30 years. It included a 33% ownership in the pipeline. No other pipeline has ever done that, even to today. It included $200 million in funding over 30 years for a employment and training fund that the chiefs would handle and distribute on their own. A $200 million fund for a community investment, which the chiefs would handle on their own and decide where that money goes. So a lot of the negotiations that took place were as a result of the communities coming together as a group and negotiating as a group with more influence and ability of certainty from the industry proponents that you had these communities behind you, because they were front and center sitting at a table every month. So it was important that we did this, and that we convey across the country that this is the type of model to be able to use. And then in 2019, we established another mandate, which was to defeat on-reserve poverty. Our membership of chiefs wanted to create some relevancy, have some more impact into our communities directly. So we started to initiate employment and training programs. Our NCC Employment Transitional Training Program is a program to employ the unemployable, and that's the 60% of our communities that I mentioned that are on social welfare. A lot of them very uneducated, and a lot of them very unskilled, and we want to be able to get them, back on the track in terms of not getting advanced education or anything like that, or upgrading, but getting them, transition from the unemployed lifestyle to the employed lifestyle, so that when they take jobs, that they can keep them. And that's been our biggest problem, is that a lot of members aren't able to transition from the reserve lifestyle to the off-reserve lifestyle. Chief Elmer Derrick used to always say, you have to treat our people like immigrants, because the socioeconomic shock of moving off to reserve is so much for the young men and women to handle that they tend to quit and run back to the reserve. So we've got to transition them and teach them the kind of things that regular Canadians are, take for granted, the description of what work is all about, having parents to be able to tell you this is what to expect when you're on a factory floor. We don't have that, right? So we got to get them, taught in that. And there's an inordinate amount of First Nation people who don't know their culture and tradition, and this 6-week program teaches them about their rich culture and tradition, makes them more proud of, where they stand as a person and where they came from and so forth. So it's all of this information that we think is important. We have a transitional mentoring program as well for students from grade 12 to first year university who want to shadow engineers, environmental consultants, everybody in a STEM program, because we're notorious for not getting STEM graduates. Our community has got one of the highest or the highest per capita post-secondary graduates in Canada, but not a lot of STEM graduates, right? Not a lot of science graduates or mathematics or economics like my degree. It's difficult, and we've got to make them understand these are the kind of jobs that come with getting into a STEM program, and a lot of them end up after we get the program going and getting the survey. We get something like 80% of them saying, yes, I'm going to enter into a STEM program. So it's important. And, when I used to teach upgrading math and calculus, people used to always ask me, and they say, what are we going to use this for anyway? It's too difficult and so forth. And I always say it's about problem solving. If you can go in there and tackle a problem, then you can create success in your own life, because CEOs in this world and managers and people that excel and succeed in society are problem solvers. And if you're going to be a person who's going to push away math, you're going to push away a lot of other problems too. So you got to tackle these problems. Engineers, for example, Alberta has probably the most concentration of engineers and technicians in the world here in Alberta. You ask an engineer to solve a problem, they'll do whatever they can to solve it. And that comes from their, education. That comes from their lifestyle, how they work. They can see a problem, and if there's not a solution, they can find one. And I think it's that expertise that's going to get us, from, the oil and gas dependency to solving the problem with clean energy transition.
Thank you for that. A lot of information there. And I think some key learnings is, first of all, the opportunity to raise the overall Canadian economy performance by making sure all the Indigenous people are full participants and, being able to contribute as much as possible for their own well-being, but that will also be good for Canada. And I think the other key point that came through is, the Indigenous people, many, because they're similar to Canadians, many are very pro-development, and to hear Northern Gateway was shut down by the Prime Minister at the time, Trudeau, it just talks about, it's not always the Indigenous people who've held projects up. Sometimes there's other powers that are played that have let the blame lay elsewhere for decisions they made. But Rob, you want to jump in, I think?
I was just, going to go back to Northern Gateway. I think Dale, you said 31 out of 40 directly affected First Nations were on board. And with all the talk of a imminent proposal maybe for a new oil pipeline to the West Coast, has that project been revived, and are all 31 or even more First Nations supportive today?
No, it hasn't been revived. Alberta's taken a big step in being able to, be the lead in supporting a first drive to evaluate the possibility of building a pipe to the West Coast. The biggest problem we have is media. Media has, said time and time again that the project was canceled because of Indigenous opposition. Well, it wasn't. It was canceled just summarily by the Prime Minister using, his ultimate authority for some reason to be able to cancel it without going through the regulatory process. You got to remember the project was approved. Project was approved. We were ready to build, and then it got delayed by a group that just basically said they weren't consulted, and they were outside the pipeline corridor. They were outside the terminal area, and the judge went ahead and said, well, these individuals have to be, or these communities have to be consulted. And we were on the verge of consulting with these communities. It doesn't mean that the project was canceled by the courts. It only meant that, the same judgment came with TMX. They went from 60 communities being affected to 129 because of that judgment. They included everybody across the board and across Western Canada almost as being, necessarily consulted in that project, and they completed it, right? And we were confident we could complete the same thing. I mean, you got to prove to the regulator that the risks of this project outweigh the benefits. And you got to prove that there's a genuine risk for a spill or damage to the ecosystem. And none of those lawsuits and interveners could prove that. And that's why the regulatory approved the project. So I always say you got to go to the people that know. You got to go to the pipeliners. You got to meet with them. When you're a leader, you got to meet with both sides of the spectrum to get informed about the issue and the project in order to make an informed decision. And I keep telling chiefs that if you talk to the pipeliners, if you listen to them and you look at the kind of money and resources and time and people it takes to get these integrity and safety systems and environmental systems in place, you'll tend to approve the project because your comfort area is now enhanced and you're sure that it's going to be protected and that your people are safe. And that's how they got 31 communities, aligned to it. And my only problem is a political body like the Alberta government is not prepared to do consultation the way that professional consultants do. And I recommended time and time again that they need to hire the professionals. You need to hire the people that know Indigenous communities like myself, who are pipeliners and know about the pipeline system and the integrity systems and everything you can think of regarding a pipeline and the issues that communities have with them, so that you can answer them directly. And until you get that, you're not going to get First Nations communities on side. And they went ahead and didn't hire professionals. They hired, political figures, and I don't think that's the way to do it. First Nation chiefs want to be able to speak to a third party, arm's length, independent consultant who they know is not going to walk out of their office and start telling them exactly what he or she has said. They want to be able to speak candidly with somebody who they can ask the dumb questions to. They need to be able to know that everything they say is not going to get back to their community or back to the proponents. They want to be able to, evaluate the project on their own in their own time. And they need to speak to somebody who knows the pipeline industry. And they need somebody to speak and knows about the Indigenous communities, because Canadians are, if they wrote a test on what the Indigenous communities are about, they would get a 20% failure grade, guarantee it. I've grown up with people that I've attended school from grade 1 all the way through university that have never stepped one foot on my reserve. And it's because of what they don't know. They push away, right? They're scared of the reserve. They don't understand it. My sister started a soup kitchen on our reserve, one of the richest reserves in Canada. We have a soup kitchen. And she got 20 volunteers from the local communities to come in and participate as volunteers, because those people know the situation about our reserve. If all Canadians knew what those 20 people knew, we wouldn't have the kind of this located communication factor that we have in Canada today with our First Nation communities, because nobody knows about them. Nobody understands them. When you hire somebody to consult with a First Nation community member, you make sure that that person, that professional has been on a reserve, knows about reserve life, knows about reserve people, can respect them and honor them, and can respect their protocols and so forth, knows their culture and tradition, and at the same time is a industry expert as well.
But it sounds like you're not getting the band back together again on Northern Gateway.
Well, if they would have got our team back together, they would have got their team back together, I think. But you need boots on the ground. You need people rolling up their sleeves and going out there and, willing to confront the people that are against the project and to debate with them and talk about their issues, because anybody that knows the pipeline industry is going to be able to answer, environmental issues about why they think it's unsafe, because they know it's safe. These are built by Canadians. Canadians respect the environment, and they wouldn't support it unless it was, safe. And Canada's, one of the few countries in the world that respects the environment and has the safety features like nobody else. You'd have to go to Norway, to Scandinavian countries to get the kind of safety features that exist within Canada. That's because they too are in the northern climate. They're in the Arctic Circle, and so forth. And so they'll use the same kind of environmental protection and integrity systems that we use.
Again, I think that perspective is very important, reinforcing, Canada's own high standards when it comes to resource development, independently of any other issues, which is important. If we can just maybe move on, something else is NCC has been one of the most vocal supporters of the federal Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program. It's now been expanded to $10 billion under Prime Minister Carney. What's your perspective on that? And is it going in the right direction? Are you happy with the progress?
Well, it's both good and bad. I mean, first part, it's good because, of course, it gives a step up for the First Nation community members to be able to get the kind of equity they need in a project in order to attain financing. And a loan guarantee is essentially even though you do have to pay it back, it is an equity position in terms of what it looks like for investors. They know that if they get $1 billion guarantee on a $10 billion project, they know 10% of that money is guaranteed to get repaid back. On the second hand, it's the same situation where First Nations are being coddled. They're saying, "Oh, we know the struggles you're having, and we think we can help you with this by, giving you something like that to be able to get you a little bit, moving a little bit forward." And we're of the opinion, and most of our chiefs that support us, 81 across this country, are pro-development First Nation leaders, and they want, to be able to own projects. They want to be able to be the lead in projects. They don't want to go hand in hand to the industry and to the government and say, please let us be a part of this. They want to be able to lead it, and we should be leading it. It's our own fault that we're not, but we've been so separated by the government's placement of us in these postage stamp communities across the country, rather than giving us a large piece of land for our tribe the way the United States has given a lot of the First Nations, a piece of land that has all of their tribes within it. It's because of those postage stamp type lands that we have that we can't get together. We can't work together. We can't work as a group. That's why the coalition model is so important. So we got to be able to get together and to, own the resources, not just oil and gas and mining and industry. It's also got to include natural resources such as water. We've struggled with being able to clean our own water because we're such small communities. We can't build our own water purification systems because it's just too hard for us to maintain. We're up in the north. We're so isolated. Almost 70% of our communities are not in or near metropolitan areas. So we can't give our people clean drinking water. So we got to form a coalition to be able to do those type of things. And, Chief Terrence Paul, for example, the Nova Scotia Embrace that model, started the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority. And today they have some 19 communities working together to build their own water infrastructure. He got 6 of them to join together to buy the fisheries for $1.5 billion. So it's that coalition model that we need to utilize more in order to build these type of things. And that goes along with, oil and gas initiatives. 26 communities bought up Tamarack's assets, some $1.85 billion worth of assets. Communities got together, and with the help of Enbridge and TC Energy, was able to purchase portions of their infrastructure, their pipeline lines. But we got to lead pipelines. And I think Northern Gateway, the Northern Gateway 2.0 is not going to go unless it's led by First Nations.
Yeah, that is certainly the evolution, isn't it, Dale? We've seen a fight for decades or more for just the right to be consulted, and then accommodated, and that has evolved to equity, participation, but more and more the discussion is about actually leading these projects. And it's an exciting time. And a lot of what you say resonates, and why we started the Canadian Indigenous Investment Summit in London to try and change the perception of foreign investors that Indigenous people, their perception that Indigenous people are against all development. And so we brought people like yourself over to London to talk about Indigenous-led projects and what it takes to get Indigenous people on side. Your coalition, maybe talk a little bit about who are your members and who you speak for.
Well, we had our first gathering in 2018 in Vancouver. We had our first All Chiefs Conference. 2019, 81 chiefs came to our conference there. So we were originally a group of 7 chiefs that were from the Northern Gateway Project, 4 from Alberta, 3 from BC. But right around 2019, we wanted to pull away from being a oil and gas centric organization to being a natural resource organization. We knew there was a lot of resources in Eastern Canada as well as Northern Canada. So we expanded our group of advisors, chiefs from Canada, across Canada. And it's been pretty successful in being able to transfer that coalition model to a lot of First Nations across the country because, as an administrator, I've worked with my band for 22 years. I've always said First Nations, they have a hard time working together. But once you get them together with a common goal that they can't change, and that was one of the things the Northern Gateway did so well, was they gave them 10% of the ownership of the project, free and clear, gifted, and it was equally distributed between all the communities. So even if you were 5,000, 10,000 community members and another community was only 600, you still got the same level of ownership in the project. That meant that the smaller communities would now be able to come to the table because they knew they had a voice at the table. They knew they had an equal standing with the bigger nations. And that was important because when you want approval within a region from a small community and another region from a bigger community, you have to get them both. And the only way to get them both is to get them on level negotiation terms. And I think that's probably the most important thing that we've seen from the project. And we're optimistic about what's happening across Canada. The mining in Ontario, the new funding in the Northwest Territories, the uranium mining in Saskatchewan, the expansion of critical minerals mining across this country is going to be important for the clean energy transition, and energy security is becoming an issue that has turned the tables in terms of approval for fossil fuel production in Canada. Now more than 50% of Canadians want fossil fuel production, which hasn't happened since before 2015, right?
Yes. So, there's a lot going on. Obviously, the world's changed in the past year, not just with our neighbors, but within the country itself under Prime Minister Carney's new government and the setting up of the Major Projects Office and the Indigenous Advisory Council. What are some of your perspective on these changes would be very interesting for all of us to hear.
Well, it's a lot of rhetoric. I think Mark Carney was looking to delay every decision that he promised until he could get perspective on what the Canadian people wanted, which meant that he wasn't approving any projects and hasn't approved any projects, except the long-hanging fruits that would have been approved without him being there anyway. If Poilievre got in, I think we would have had boots on the ground right now in construction of Northern Gateway 2.0, but he's not. And we're getting just a lot of rhetoric. I mean, who signs an MOU saying, oh, we'll work together to try to find a solution there's no solution. The solution is clear. The path is clear, I should say. There's no solution. The path is to get our resources out of this country. and not just to the United States, but to the international market. And the only way to do that is go to the West Coast. And
Yes.
Unfortunately, a lot of people on the West Coast don't understand the strategic location of that port is so unique in that it's a shorter route to Asia than any other port in North America. So whether they like it or not, that port in Prince Rupert is going to become one of the biggest ports in North America within 20 years, because everybody knows you can't get a whole lot of things out of Vancouver. I mean, you can't even fill up an Aframax tanker in Burnaby because the waters are too shallow. That's why Kitimat was such an important port. It had the deepest, widest, safest channel in North American West Coast, and it took engineers years to choose which port they wanted to go through. If they thought Vancouver was going to be the best port, they would have chose that. If they thought Hudson's Bay was the best port, they would have done that. So you're talking about engineers who evaluated the situation. I mean, we know that the Premier wants to go to Prince Rupert, but we evaluated those right-of-ways, and in order to get to Prince Rupert, you got to go through the Portland Inlet, and that takes 225 kilometers of underground pipeline or under the water pipeline, which is very difficult to get public approval for. So, I mean, there's technology that is safe. They do it all over Europe. Laying pipe on the ocean floor, but everybody has a problem with that, and it was because of the safety and the terrain that's the right of way towards Kitimat gave to Northern Gateway. That was the reason they chose that pipeline route. I mean, they were going to drill 2 tunnels through 2 mountains to get there. And they had a wider than normal right of way because they knew as soon as they were going to get that pipeline to the coast, they were going to apply for a expansion, because everybody's going to want their pipe on that, or their oil on that pipeline, because it's going to get Brent prices rather than WCS prices, which right now are about $24 difference.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's still, the route that was identified earlier is still the way to go.
Well, it's the same route that CGL is taking right now, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
The only difference between CGL and Northern Gateway is CGL is taking the gas pipelines over the mountains, exposing the pipeline to the weather. But it's a gas pipeline. It's safe. It's not as pressurized, not as volatile as moving solid liquids. So it's I think it's a good thing to happen for Alberta to have a LNG pipeline going through. But you got to remember, it was 2008 when the first applications were filed. Both United States and Canada applied for LNG pipelines at the same time. United States now has 14 ports. And all we got is LNG that just started operating last year. So we're still 1/10 of the production being shipped out of ports compared to the United States. And even with everything that we have for applications and everything that the United States has for applications, if they were all approved, we'd still be only 10% of the production that the United States is able to get off their shores. So it's upsetting, but
it's been a huge missed opportunity.
It's what Canada's become over the last decade with the Trudeau government.
Mm-hmm.
You got to remember, I was on Alberta Clipper and Southern Lights. From the first day of the preliminary information package to the first day of operations was 4 years. And that was 2 pipelines, Alberta Clipper and Southern Lights. That was one of the biggest pipelines in the world at the time. And we got it built in 4 years. Only 2 years of construction, 2 years of satisfying regulatory permit process. But you'll never see that again, right?
And remind us, what years are we talking about?
They were built in 2006 to 2010 from It was a bitumen pipeline with a condensate pipeline going the other way to fill up. It went from Fort McMurray to the terminal in Hardisty all the way down to Superior, Wisconsin. It's the main trunk line that Enbridge has for its oil and gas transportation system. It has about 8 lines on it right now as we speak. Some 28 different tributary pipelines that connect with it as well. So it's a huge system. And, we added another 2 pipelines like that in no time. And they were laying pipe 4 kilometers a day in some areas. It's just amazing. We had 381, I think it was, identified original Indigenous workers on that pipeline. So we had a lot of success with consulting as a group when we did it up to the end of Northern Gateway. By the time Northern Gateway was done, most of the big pipeline companies already had incorporated their own departments. Enbridge, I can remember, started in 2006 with 3 or 4 people that worked directly with pipeline consultation with Indigenous communities, and they hired us to assist them. And by the time we were done Northern Gateway, there were in around 50 or 60 employees directly involved with Indigenous consultation. So it's kind of transitioned into a process that I don't agree with. When safety was a big issue back in the 80s and 90s, it made sense for companies to hire third-party contractors to build their safety departments because it made sense. It was science. There was right and wrong, left and right. Same thing with environmental consultation, environmental protection. They hired third-party environmental consultant groups, and they got them to build their environmental safety, department within their corporations. That made sense too, because environmental science is science. It's right and wrong, left and right. But environmental or Indigenous consultation is not. You can't hire Indigenous consultants who can work equally across this country or on any project. You've got to hire people who are aware of the situation in that specific region with the tribe that exists there. And you've got to get pipeliners too. So, and if it fails the way, some of these projects have been failing, you can pull that consultant away and say, we're going to replace them with somebody else, so that the chiefs feel comfortable that they're talking to somebody that they communicate with. And consultation is a part of building relationships, and relationship building is not a science. You look at, I compare it to mergers and acquisitions, right? 2 companies get together and they don't get their relationship or merger employees to negotiate with each other. They hire a third-party contractor like CIBC World Markets or into mergers and acquisitions. And CIBC World Markets doesn't work for one corporation or the other's interest. It works for the interest of the merger. And that's what you need for relationship building in industry projects, that you need communication with and relationship building with First Nation communities. And that's important because, consulting with somebody who lives by the oil sands like Fort McKay First Nation is different from somebody who lives in the Yukon who have no oil and gas, no real oil sands production. So it's different. It's going to take time. It's going to take longer. You're going to have to give them more resources to be able to educate them about what the project's all about so they can make an informed decision. And that's why we developed the 5 conditions for FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, on the UNDRIP legislation. And we communicated that to NRCan, to ECCC, and so forth. And we said we needed some sort of regulatory system within UNDRIP in order to get certainty for investors to come in. And, we were on the, last part of the UNDRIP action implementation plan, or action plan implementation process before Carney got elected. And that whole process just stopped when Carney got elected, and nothing's happened ever since. So the UNDRIP thing still hangs on over the heads of investors. They're not optimistic or willing to invest in Canada with that legislation in place, and we've got to get clarity on that. It's too ambiguous, and you've seen it with the Cowichan decision, the Musqueam decision about what happens when First Nations are given their rights to lands that were previously given to them under agreement by the federal governments. And I think that's important because they didn't need the UNDRIP legislation to get that decision, in my opinion. They just got it because it was part of the BC, UNDRIPA they call, or DRIPA they call, that they passed several years ago. So we were interveners on both DRIPA and UNDRIP legislation, both in BC and in Canada. And we're still concerned about that legislation, not because, it's taken away any rights from Indigenous people. I think it enhances the rights of Indigenous people, but at the same time, we have no intention of making our rights in such a situation where that, we get total veto power over every development going on in this country. Is just unfair, especially to, fee simple landowners. Individual rights and individual property rights are the cornerstone to democratic society and to the ability of our capital system to succeed. Without private property ownership, we wouldn't have the kind of success that we have in North America. And we don't want to be a hindrance to that. We don't want to be someone who is above that law.
Great insights, Dale. Rob, do you have any other questions at the moment for Dale? Or
lots of other questions, maybe over a drink sometime, but
Yes.
Not at the moment, Dale. Is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to cover today?
I know that there's a lot of questions about the UNDRIP legislation, about the Cowichan decision, but I think the focus on politics right now, unfortunately, has become a big influencer of our economy, and it's unfortunate, and it's because of the 10 years that we went through with Trudeau that we're in a situation where our economy is suffering, and that's when Ottawa always steps in and tries to help. But I'm seeing a lot more, or I should say, I'm being a lot more optimistic about what's going on with Canadians and how they feel about energy security. I think that's important. We live in a society, where we're coddled so much that we don't understand where we came from. Back in the 70s, people died from the weather. People froze to death on the middle of a highway. Canadians were the kind of people that stopped on a highway for anybody who was in distress, and we don't see that anymore because vehicles now are more secure. Our infrastructure is more secure. Heating is more secure. It's more affordable. Electricity is more secure. It's more affordable. But when you get into a situation where energy becomes threatened by a local neighbor that's been supporting us for centuries, I mean, it's terrifying to think that your house could lose power for an indeterminate amount of time when it's 30 or 40 below outside. I mean, that could really hurt you. And now people are starting to realize, why are we opposing this so much? Why are we opposing, our natural resource industry that's taken us out of this situation where we feared the weather, where we feared, our ability to be able to secure our own heating for our own house, electricity to keep our lights on and so forth. Young people grow up, they don't understand they're living in a northern society not far from the Arctic Circle. They've got to stop protesting against things that keep them alive. And I think that's important. So, I shake my head all the time because, I grew up thinking the Great White Fathers are going to take care of us because, they're intelligent, they're advanced, and now I'm shaking my head all the way from, 2015 on about the decisions that our government is making on the decisions that people are making on surveys about industry, about their fellow Canadians. I just don't understand that. I know there's this push and pull between the East and the West all the time, but that's a political push and pull, and it shouldn't be a Canadian push and pull. Canadians, are good people. They're the best people in the world. I mean, I know it. I grew up with Canadians. They're great people, and it's this bipolar political system that's pulling them apart. And I think that's so unfair. And I think something's got to be done about it. There has to be a neutral association that has got to protect our society from this bipolar political destructiveness that's going on right now. And I'm glad to see that Canadians are starting to get back into reality and saying, hey, we need this oil and gas system until we get something to replace fossil fuels. And wind and solar are not going to do it in Canada. I'll tell you that. I mean, I've gone to home from school in the dark how many times growing up. To think that solar is going to power our homes doesn't make sense.
Absolutely. We all remember those long, dark mornings and that's dark, right. Early afternoons.
And when you're from the reserve, it's much darker. I can tell you that.
Yes, I'm sure it is. But thank you for that. Great insights. And, I think we all believe one of the reasons Rob and I are doing this to provide a platform for the Indigenous people to tell their stories so Canada can realize its full potential, which is, I think, what you're talking about. How do we unleash? Because we are all very fortunate on the land that we live in is so bountiful and has so many different natural resources. And you've talked about how can we succeed to get those to market in the quickest and most effective manner with the support of the communities along the way. So I think that's been a great conversation, Dale. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, and thanks for having me. And I applaud what you guys are doing. I think it's great. It's a great initiative, and do whatever I can to expand your network to other communities in Canada.
Great. Well, maybe we'll have you over next year.
Yeah, I really appreciate your time, Dale, and your perspective. Definitely going to check out your conference in October, and I hope you'll watch for ours and maybe be involved next year, spring in London. But in the meantime, Nyawa.
Thank you again, Dan. Thank you to Dale Swampy for sharing his insights with us, and thank you for viewing and listening. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.